I don't know about you, but I am ready to quit my job. I mean, everyone is overworked. Everyone is exhausted. And one of the things I really like about your book is the fact that it forefronts that fact. So it starts with the fact that work is actually exhausting, and starts with that in the very preface to the book. So one of the things I really liked was that you mentioned in the opening that the writing of this book was impacted by your, let's say, sort of a close encounter with COVID-19, and that this shaped what kind of book it was and what kind of book it could have been. So I'm wondering if you'd like to tell us a bit about the relationship between your own experience, about the relationship between working on a book and being exposed to COVID-19 and how that shaped the work on it.
Yeah, I think so the context here is that in sort of the spring of 2020, I had what must have been COVID at the time, or what I thought was COVID. Testing wasn't broadly available, but I got initially better, but then got much more ill and carried on getting ill until things started to slowly improve. But I was very ill during the writing of the book, which meant that the way I wrote it was writing 250 words a day was my target, which is not very much. I mean, it's obviously a lot more than 0 words, and that's what I told myself every day. But you know, before I was sick, I was easily able to write like a few thousand words a day. And what that meant was, and the reason for that was just I was struggling kind of cognitively and physically. So at the worst with the kind of fatigue and energy problems, I couldn't stand up while I was waiting for the kettle to boil. And I was extremely lucky to be in a situation where I had a partner who could take on kind of the household work, and I had sick pay from my PhD scholarship body, right? So I was extremely lucky, because the majority of people who suddenly get or develop a kind of post-viral issue or an energy limiting impairment end up stuck on extremely low pay through sick pay if they're even eligible for that. So I was extremely lucky that I could kind of focus on getting better and focus on finishing the book. But I think what it meant for the book was that, and I mean, I guess this is always the case, right? When you write something, there's the original Inculcate idea of the text versus the thing that's actually produced, and then obviously every reader has their own version of it, right? But there's always a gap between what you thought it would be and what it would be. But I imagined it would be, I guess, more sort of precise account of what exactly was bad about work. You know, here is what work is, here's a list of all of the necessary sufficient conditions, here are the harms, here are what you know, here are some concrete examples of each one. I thought it would be much more kind of I guess a more standard kind of broadly accessible philosophical book. But instead, I think it's a bit more conversational, a bit more essayistic, which I think kind of works because, I mean, it's easy for me to say it works, but I think it adds something to the book because there is something about the way in which there's a lot of things are written about work at the moment, and there's a tendency to say everything about work is fundamentally bad, and I get that because I think it is broadly the case. However, I think there is the way in which work kind of takes up people's aspirations or people's emotional states, puts them to work, and this means that actually just going around and saying it's terrible doesn't necessarily kind of slip in. So you need a kind of more subtle way of thinking about how work plays on our desires, on our kind of emotional states, on our plans for the future, right? And how it kind of cannibalizes them. So I think the conversational style, essayistic style did help that. And I think I also had to learn during that time about a bit about how a kind of persistence, which you have to have when you've got fatigue. You can't get everything done very quickly, and how that can yield different kinds of thinking. Yeah.
I think that's a great note, because what I wanted to say is I think you've just highlighted something that has been a very frequently reported effect of COVID, both whilst people have it and in the aftermath, which is the inability to sustain focus, the inability to work for longer sustained periods of time. And I think in that sense, when you highlight something that's a fundamental relationship between COVID-19 and work, which often gets sidelined when the focus is on questions of availability or unavailability of work. So for instance, obviously unemployment and furlough. And I think it does bring, although clearly these questions are no less central for it, but in that sense, it does bring into question the question precisely of, well, what are the long-term effects of working under conditions of contemporary capitalism, which in this particular case, or for the last year and then some, has meant pandemic capitalism. So highlighting in that sense that work is often about exhaustion, it's often about attrition, something that Lauren Belland, for instance, has emphasized in the sense of it is a process of slow wearing out. And it is a process of wearing out not only of, people we normally think are being worn out by it, but perhaps this was precisely the moment when even people who were or are regularly relatively shielded from the most detrimental effects of work actually realize how pervasive those effects are for everyone. So in that sense, I think it's a really good point that work is not only a source of pride or creativity or energy, as I think also someone has put in the chat. I mean, it can be all that, and we'll be talking about what that means as well, but it is also a source of harm, and it is a source of harm obviously not irrespectively of what kind of work one does, but under COVID-19 conditions, it's almost universally also a source of risk or harm. So that brings me to my second question, and that does pertain to intellectual labor and perhaps the production of books as a form of dead labor, which is what I was thinking about as you were talking about your relationship to your own book. I was thinking about the fact that I think I always saw my own sort of product outputs of intellectual labor as really reified, really dead labor, very, very proper Marxist in that sense. So I think that's one of the reasons why I always have a slight resistance to writing anything that remains. But when philosophers and academics in general talk about work, we often, I think, end up talking, and in particular political philosophers, we often end up taking intellectual work or academic labor as somehow a representative or a cipher for work in general. And that's fascinatingly one of the things that you do not do, which I think is really commendable, to say at the very least. But how would you then, or how do you go about in the book distinguishing between work and not work? So what is work under contemporary capitalist conditions as opposed to not work?
Yeah, I think the point I want to make in the book is that this distinction, which seems pretty straightforward when you think about it, first of all, you're like, of course I know what work is, that's the place I go every day, suddenly can become very fuzzy and very hard when you start to really think about it. I guess one example is, before the pandemic, almost everyone would say work is a place I go to. Now work is also, for many people, in your home, not for everyone, but for many people. So that element seems to have gone. And it seems when you really kind of drill down into it, there isn't necessarily this easy, simple definition. Instead, you have, I think, a variety of kind of activities which share some common features, but it's not one of those definitions where you can say, aha, it is exactly this. It's more like activity which tends to be waged, but isn't not necessarily paid for, not under which you don't really have control of what you're doing, and which your time, when it's sold as wage labor, yourself in control of what you're doing for units of time. So there's one fundamental element is this lack of control. And that looks different in different bits of work, right? Some workers have kind of amounts of autonomy. But it becomes complicated too when you think about the tasks involved. So the location is complicated, the kind of degree of control you have is complicated, and it touches on the law there too. For example, one of the big terrains legally of what I think counts as law is whether is this kind of this Uber ruling, for example, where if you're sitting around waiting, there's a strong case that should be considered. You're not in control of that time, right? You're doing it for the employer. But Uber's argument was, no, that doesn't. They're not working for Uber at that time, but they're on call. And there was a similar situation with care home workers who stay overnight in the care home, and you're sleeping because it's the nighttime, however you're on call, right? And unlike the Uber ruling, that went the other way, so it went in the employer's favor. It was just deemed that when you were asleep you weren't working, even though you could be woken up at any time. And there are similar rulings with kind of traveling between places, so that the control element is one bit. Then the task element is another bit, because a lot of the work under kind of contemporary capitalism in Britain tends to be kind of relational, tends to be kind of service focused, right? So there, the product isn't as obvious. And one example, and I'm going to do that terrible academic thing of using an academic example, but I think it's enlightening here. So this was brought up during the last round of strikes. If you're on the picket line, you're supposed to be striking. You're not supposed to be doing work. However, what if you have an idea? What if you have an idea for your research? And this points to the problem of saying, exactly when you have kind of this contemporary form of work, which encompasses a huge range of activities, often very relational ones, which aren't as easy to kind of fit into. It's not that they're not commodified, but the full commodification of them is a little bit harder, rather than if we imagine the kind of paradigmatic, we've got a box factory, we're making boxes. So it becomes complicated when it's kind of social and relational. So that's another kind of aspect of it that is really difficult. The one thing that I'm really interested in is why it is that leisure, many people report leisure feeling more like work. And that's interesting, right? That divide, and again, historically, kind of, if we imagine paradigmatic kind of Fordist setup, middle 20th century in the global north, you have, and this is not true of everyone, and it's a history which doesn't include the ways in which this excluded women or migrants, or how much it depended on imperialism. But we have the kind of Fordist bargain, right, is you have boredom at work and leisure on the weekends. That's it, that's the deal. Whereas now we could say people's working lives spread more and more into their leisure time in a couple of different ways. One is the lack of availability of secure full-time work, which means people will have these kind of side gigs, often on platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, and so on. And also a kind of felt experience of time, which is very anxious, which seeks to make good use of time. And this is often self-perpetuated as well. So we can draw a distinction again between its historic version. So there's this wonderful E.P. Thompson article about clock time and how workers need to be made to understand clock time by employers. And all of these kind of very didactic tracks by moralists saying you shouldn't be lying around on a hill, you should be at work. But what we have now is a kind of way in which this feeling of time is not imposed from above, but is also imposed from within, right? There's not necessarily someone telling you to be anxious about using your time well, but people report feeling this very strongly. So that's another kind of concern of the book, is that I think the fuzziness around what work actually is comes from the way in which work really is in the world, right? Our conceptual kind of confusion or conceptual difficulty has a basis in the fact that work is not this easy kind of fixed thing, but instead is kind of spreading over more and more of human life.
That's fantastic, and that's something I'd like to come back to. But one of the things that occurred to me just as you were talking is precisely the degree to which work is in some ways, as work, is unnatural. And because you talk a lot about denaturalizing as a form of theoretical move of rendering something subject to philosophical analysis or philosophical inquiry. I was actually reflecting on how much historically, actually, if we take a really long view, work is one of the sort of last things that become, in that sense, embroiled in capitalism. And obviously there's a broader Hegelian point to make here, which I, as a good Hegelian, I guess, assume and will not continue to make. But interestingly enough, or what I found interesting is that work as an object of knowledge is so central to thinking about social life for not only philosophers, but also theorists and basically sociologists, anthropologists as well, though to a lesser extent, which is really interesting, et cetera, that somehow it almost beggars belief that it's so difficult to make sense of what is outside of work. It's almost as if work is not only colonizing our lives, but it's literally also colonizing our imaginations or imaginaries, to use that perhaps slightly washed out phrase. So I'm curious about sort of the blurring of boundaries in that sense. So I'm looking at one of the things I really, I love the sort of the Pluto Chris cover designs, but I don't know if this is visible enough for everyone. Should be. So the cover of Amelia's book has I guess this would be an empty swimming pool, or at least an empty pool, an empty space, with a desk and I think a laptop, looks like a MacBook, which is also a good meta reference inside. But it does seem like there is a ladder to climb out. So what would be a way of climbing out? Recently, I mean, as you mentioned yourself, so there's almost a wave of thinking or rethinking anti and post-work policies and basically ways of making work either more tolerable or at least less exploitative. And there's also been, I mean, in addition to some of the older feminist work, like Kathy Weeks, for instance, there's also been a wave of additional sort of the refusal work and not working and et cetera. So and in addition to that, on the left in particular, there's been a resurgence of associated or affiliated ideas. So 4-day work week, 4-hour work day, universal basic income, and so on and so forth. What would you say? What's the best way to escape work?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think one thing I grapple with in the book is that there is a kind of, I guess, a seductive simplicity about this idea that we could just escape, right? Because we're formed by capitalism in really profound ways. And one of the examples I talk about, which I couldn't stop thinking about after I read about it, was how the large-scale production of antibiotics has changed the soil makeup, right? And there's a really fascinating example which relates directly to kind of American neo-imperialism and the kind of invasions in the Middle East and so on. But in general, the way in which mass production of antibiotics, which has been obviously a massive miracle and marvel for health outcomes, but has changed the makeup of the soil. And the same is true of our bodies too, right? So the same is true of our kind of psychic situations, our affective states, the way we see things, the way we think things, which doesn't mean there's no escape. It doesn't mean there's no exit, but it means that there can be a seductive ease, right? Where you say, well, we can just stop. So I think I try and explore what might the conditions be for trying to stop. And I think I also began writing the book and researching it before this big wave of discontent, but I think this would still hold. I think a lot of people are frustrated, and a lot of people have seen the power relations at work and seen that those are often typically not in the favor of the workers. But this discontent often seems limited to particular time or place. So people will say, it's just this boss, it's just this manager, it's just this job, the next one will be different. And I think there's again a kind of, we can imagine that discontent would just organically join up. But I think people tend to, I think we can overplay just how much that might be the case. don't think we should be kind of cynical automatically, because I think we have seen really profound changes during the pandemic. But I think what's required is a couple of things. One, for that discontent with particular workplaces or particular sectors of work. So, for example, a lot of this is located specifically in bits of the service sector, especially in the States, where that is really crap work because it's heavily reliant on tips, so you don't really get a proper wage. So it's especially kind of egregious form of domination, because you are expected, you rely on the customer is always right attitude profoundly shapes your life, right? And I think, you know, some of this is sector specific, but I think what is required for things to change is two things. One is this discontent to become general, as in about capitalism, about work in general, rather than about particular workplaces or particular sectors. And the other is to have a movement that can propel it. There are lots of, or for it to join into. So we have discontent. We need the transformation of consciousness. Then we need a site. We need agents, right, to make that happen. And one worry I have is that there are lots of great ideas. And I'm sure my book is also guilty of this too, but we need the actual kind of union power. We need the people who are going to make this happen, because it's not the kind of thing that there are some employers in kind of prestige sectors or in kind of different bits of the economy where they can kind of experiment a little bit themselves. And there have been, but these are not kind of generalizable. So the 4-day week is an interesting example, because you could have people in particular sectors, say a really kind of fun workplace that wanted to keep people and didn't want to lose employers because it costs a lot of money to rehire people. They might be interested in a 4-day week because people might ask for it. But then if we think about a supermarket worker on a 0-hours contract, what use is a 4-day week if the problem is they're not getting enough work? So how do we kind of join up these two struggles, and how do we build the kind of union power and political movement that can do that? It's not something that can be done it's not something that can be done without power, basically. There's shifts in attitudes, but I think what I would say is for them to become more general, we need to be rebuilding that union density, and rebuilding, some of it might be also rebuilding social movements around that and connecting those struggles to the environment. That's something that I think has a lot of potential as well.
I think that's a great point. And I think it brings me to something that I also really appreciated about your book, because it gets into, or at least introduces, other references as well that do get into the knit and grit of contemporary union organizing, rather than just saying, well, you know, there should be solidarity between different sectors, or we need to organize and then stop at that. It actually talks about the challenges of organizing and what organizing under contemporary capitalism means. So related to that, I was going to bring up two things. So let's start with the first and see if we have time to address the second. So just as a reminder, you can start asking questions. So participants, audience can start asking questions in the Q&A. So one of the things was precisely the fact that the refusal of work, regardless of whether it takes the shape of industrial action or different, less organized and, you know, perhaps a bit more creative or whatever, less systematic forms of action, is also work. And one of the things that were obvious to me is precisely the way in which the refusal of work for some workers, and I don't want to say only privileged ones, although that clearly is the majority, or sectors that have more job security, entails the continuation of work for other people. So to give an example, the continuation of work for people who deliver, so delivery drivers, etc., the continuation of work for people who engage in paid or semi-paid childcare and so on and so forth, because obviously if you are standing on the picket line, you are also not somewhere else. So perhaps this is one of the main challenges in terms of realizing that our own refusal of work often depends on someone else's continuation of work. As a matter of fact, so how to undo that particular tie is, to me, one of the most obviously burning questions. You know, how to make sure that we don't recourse to saying, well, okay, I'm really busy, I spent the whole day on the picket line, or I spent the whole day in union organizing, now I'm just gonna order, just eat or something like that because I can't be bothered to make dinner, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And I think one thing I'm keen to talk about in the book is that the underpinnings of that kind of precarious platform, often service work, which has been dubbed things like the servant economy, is that you have national and global inequality at a huge scale, right? This is why it is possible for such platforms to work. You need to have really low wages, you need to have people who are willing to pay, and you need to have, the other thing is that these companies are kind of supported by financial investments, right? In the sense that Uber's never made a profit, right? So there's the belief that one day it will make a profit. That's what's funding it. So it's this particular kind of confluence of factors which makes these platforms viable. I think one thing I guess I talk about in the book is the way that social reproduction moves from being done within the home to being done within the home and the market, right? So you have this mixture of very low paid and unpaid work. And some of that is because there is, and it's not only kind of privileged people doing this, like almost as soon as people can afford it, they start to buy out lots of socially reproductive housework, because that work is often quite frustrating, especially if people are already tired from their day of work. But it's kind of, I think that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of social reproduction, is just how much of it is done in the market, and how that it does depend on this very high inequality situation. And one idea or set of ideas I talk about is communalizing aspects of social reproduction. Things like having cheap publicly owned restaurants with decent salaries, in which you can stay for as long as you want, in which children are welcome, in which you can go and eat at, right? Or one thing I think about a lot is when you walk down a street and you think about the replication of work, by each household doing everything, right? And of course, it's not to say everyone should necessarily live in a commune and do everything together, but there are many ways in which that overall toll of work could be really significantly reduced. Including creches. And I talk a little bit about how this relates to feminist demands and the gender distribution of that work as well, because it's really fascinating. One of the first demands of the British Women's Liberation Movement was free 24-hour creches, and that's the only one of the original demands in Britain that hasn't been met or partially met, which is really fascinating, because it is one of those demands that would potentially change quite a lot about how families are structured, quite a lot about how reproductive work is structured, and it's the one that has not been met. And instead we have privatized nursery chains, which are very exploitative of workers, very exploitative of parents, and very brittle and fragile to shocks. So they're all in a bit of trouble after COVID as well. Yeah.
And they also contribute to the reproduction of social inequalities, because they obviously depend either on workplace allocation. So, university workers all have their children in the same creches, or they depend on locale or location, which is then itself socially stratified. So that brings me to the last thing that I really wanted to discuss, and that is the element of the book when you talk about the relationship between undoing exploitative forms of, shall we say, labor that has been traditionally recognized as labor, so productive labor, and socially reproductive labor, so especially traditionally, obviously, the work that was usually assigned to women within the home, from obviously childbirth and child rearing to maintenance of the house environment, but is now, and actually over quite a few decades, among the wealthy, and especially the wealthy families in the global north, increasingly outsourced also to immigrants. So what would be, and I mean, modes of communal living that you bring up are one example, but what also would need to change in order to have a wholesale change of the relationship to work? Because I think one of the things that you really emphasize is precisely the idea that as long as workplaces change as such, without everything else changing as well, it may make work perhaps a bit better, a bit more tolerable for some people, but it's clearly not going to create any sort of large-scale social change. So you talk about the denaturalization of the concept that I really, really like and have actually not encountered prior to your book. So denaturalizing the assumption that family is the major reproductive unit, which, I mean, clearly there is a longer critique of this, including in anarchist feminism, but applying the concept of feminist realism, family realism to that was really great for me to kind of say, well, okay, no, it's actually not in any sort of way necessary to assume that families are privileged reproductive units. So how would we go about doing both, so to speak? How would we go about transforming both socially reproductive labor and more narrowly, I guess, capitalist-related, profit-related, productive labor?
So I think you're so right to point to the ways in which just these kind of minor changes, so improving a bit of work here, a bit of work there, a bit of each workplace, won't change very much. And we need a more fundamental restructuring. I would say one thing that would make a difference to both the productive and reproductive side is to take some or many socially significant kind of goods out of market dependence. So making it the case that something like a universal basic services, basically. So again, free childcare, things like a national food service, or making kind of publicly owned democratic goods with better working conditions for those involved with more of a say in how they do their work, and also offering services and also kind of services to different people who need them, which would reduce the kind of extent of I guess, yeah, I like using this concept drudgery, which suggests there's a kind of amount of work that has to be done, but work on top of that, which doesn't really need to be done. So I think of these people who are kind of obsessive cleaners of their kitchens, right? Or their house has to be spotless, right? And this sense of kind of drudgery, of this additional needless work, this replicated work. And I think it's not always easy to draw that line and say, this is necessary, this isn't necessary. I think that's a kind of, in some ways, I mean, it's very easy to say particular things aren't and particular things are, but many things are shades in between. But I think that would be a really helpful solution, would be redistributing work. There are people who want more work, there are people who want far less work, and communalizing aspects of socially reproductive work through something like a universal basic services, increasing workers' control over what they do, which you can't really do without changing who owns the means of production. You reach a point where there's a lot you can do without changing that, which would change work quite significantly. But you get to a certain point, which looks like something like workers' control, which you can't get to. And beyond that as well, once you have ownership, you have this question of changing the class basis of society, which comes back to the point you were making about nurseries and how nurseries not only produce, the commodity that being sold is the care of the children, but it's also reproducing class society as a whole, because it's teaching children who they are, how they should behave, how they relate to others of their own class, of different classes, and so on. So changing the class character of production is one of those things that goes in that bit once you have a change in ownership. But there's a lot you can do in that bit before. Obviously, that's a big challenge. It's one of those things which is very easy to say, we need to change ownership. It's obviously much harder to do.
Well, we know some examples of some proposals on how to change ownership over means of production. So let's just leave it at that, and perhaps leave it to the audience to think about whether some of these means might be useful. I think I'm going to start with Q&A, because we are getting quite a few interesting questions now. So if you don't mind, if that's okay for you. Great. So Charlie is asking whether you have seen or can imagine any positive examples of how work has been constructed in a meaningful way.
As in sort of by employers or by people in general? I think, because I think we can see kind of a fleeting experience of meaningfulness. If we think about, I mean, the strikes are a good example in a way, because they do depend on the reproductive labor of people not involved, but they're hard work, they're difficult work. However, there's a kind of freedom and shared activity that comes in them, which can feel quite profoundly exciting. Not all the time. Sometimes it's just standing around in the cold. But you get this when people talk about activist work they've done. And there are some really great reflections of, I think, miners' wives from the miners' strikes, talking about their experiences of being involved in this activity, of organizing the support, organizing the solidarity funds, organizing these events, and how it felt like a profoundly transformative experience for them, because it's not the absence of work in the broad sense, right? There's a possibility for doing creative activity, human activity together, and that doesn't look like not doing anything at all. It looks like doing things together in a very different way. So I think there's that little kernel of freedom can be seen in bits of everyday life, and some jobs also do have that. I think I'm very clear in the book and generally that all work is, the majority of work has these extremely harmful features, but some jobs do have this kind of zone of autonomy, or this little feeling of freedom, and that's important too.
I think it also comes to being able to exercise control over the product. So not only over the process, but over the outcomes as well in some ways. And I was discussing not long ago intellectual ownership with someone, and the relationship between the idea of, although obviously, well, first of all, intellectual labor is not a model for all sorts of labor, as we've already said, and also it's not always the case, but there is, at least I've always felt that significant difference between whether I am producing something in order for that to be shared with other people to stimulate discussion, etc., or whether I'm producing something that I feel is being used to generate profit for, more specifically, my employer or someone else. So I think that's also another interesting distinction in terms of autonomy over the outcome or product, or not only the process. We have a fantastic question from Joanna, who is saying, you have touched on some of the interplay between work and women of feminism, but I was hoping you could say something about what has been called neoliberal feminism and how this fits into your picture of work.
Great. So I guess I'll just maybe say first what I take neoliberal feminism to be. I guess it's a feminism which focuses on outcomes for individual women within business or within kind of career progression as individuals, with the implication that the benefits accrue to those women at the top kind of flow down to women in general, or there's something to be gained from the promotion of women to these particular roles. And I would say that it assumes that self-realization is found in the market. And this is not feminism, which is something that feminists ought to problematize, right? Where is freedom found? And it tends to focus on individual happiness, individual fulfillment, rather than saying, well, what really should we be doing, or what really should society be like? I've been teaching a module on feminism, which has been fascinating, and kind of going through some kind of canonical texts. And one of the things we read was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And there's this great line in it where she says, I'm not bothered about happiness, I'm bothered about freedom. People could be happy in all kinds of situations, right? And I think that's one aspect of neoliberal feminism, which liberalism attaches itself to, which is the sense that you shouldn't tell someone that they should be unhappy with their lot, or that something is wrong in their life, right? And I think this is the thing that's really important, and I really want to say in the book, is because actually, although there are all of these harms, profound psychological, physiological, psychic, affective, emotional, relational harms at work, many people report enjoying their jobs. So what do we do with that, right? If we just said we must not tell people that they're wrong to feel the way they do, we wouldn't be able to say very much at all. And I think that's one, it's interesting because I think there's been a lot of pushback against neoliberal feminism, but that's one bit that's really stuck, this sense that you shouldn't tell people that or you shouldn't say that whatever people's preferences are should be questioned. And I think that's one thing that I think is extremely important to do. yeah, otherwise you end up not being able to say very much at all. Yeah, but I think it is a really fascinating question. I hope I've kind of done it justice.
I think it's one that we could probably go on sort of answering and talking about. Perhaps we need a separate event for it. And I mean, as you were talking, I was again reminded of Lauren Bellant, in part because I'm rereading Cruel Optimism, which I think is a really good diagnosis of the present moment, precisely on the capacity of capitalism to enroll or continue exploiting that kind of effective investment that people have into any sort of activity. So it basically relies on the capacity of people to become invested or to use work as a mode of projecting their own well-being and so on and so forth. That does bring me to the next question, which I think is in some ways related. So the person is saying, I'm on the faculty of a college in the US that aims to educate the world's elite. This semester, after a year of COVID online teaching, I'm seeing among our highly educated and very ambitious students that many of them are saying it's all too much in response to what used to be a normal workload. Do you see this as a hopeful sign? I mean, I just want to, before you answer, I want to say this is really interesting because I am seeing something similar to that among students. And I mean, I would probably, anyway, I don't want to, it's a question to you, Amelia, not to me.
I also want to hear your answer, so I'll keep mine short. I think it's hopeful in one sense that a lot of these kind of elite credentialized institutions, especially in the States, have a kind of like code of silence around competitiveness. So everyone is intensely competitive. Everyone is intensely puts themselves under extreme pressure. So admitting the presence of that pressure and saying they can't do it is good. I don't think I'll be able to say much more without knowing the kind of specific conditions of it, because it could be kind of ambiguous as well. It could just also be that people are so profoundly unwell after their experiences this year. That's also possible. But I want to hear what you think, because I'm not sure. I think it's a really interesting thought, but I think it's potentially good, possibly ambiguous.
I think to me it points to something that you also touch on in the book, which is the possibility of wholesale refusal, not only of exploitative modes in which labor is currently organized and has been organized for some time, but also this investment into the idea that more is always better in different ways. And there's obviously a climate change related element to that as well. Or there are consequences for climate change, but also consequences for reinforcing this idea that, you know, this is how things should be. And clearly the only thing that everyone should be doing is doing their best and getting on with the program. So to me, challenging workloads within universities by students, so not only by staff, also serves to highlight the degree to which the entirety of the project in which you are supposed to be working very hard throughout your education. And I mean, there's also a shifting or increasing workload on pre-university or at pre-university education levels. I mean, I hear from friends and acquaintances who have children at different levels of schooling that the amount of homework is really immense. And it seems really as if in no metaphoric way it is training for participation in the capitalist economy, which is not a 9-to-5 one, it's more a 0-to-24 one. So in that sense, I think if we see it as perhaps a refusal of that, or at least an opening of the possibility to refuse that, I would definitely think it's a good thing. But then on the other hand, that Amelia, as you say, if it's just a way of saying, well, I'm a bit exhausted, that is clearly also valid. But I think we need to see or strive to find out whether there's something behind that. And I would also say, I think, at least for my mind, our work as academics, as lecturers, is precisely to perhaps encourage students to think about, you know, well, you know, it's not me, it's capitalism in that sense, or what is it that is harming you, which isn't clearly a way for us to disown responsibility for other things. I see 3 other questions. Let me see how much time we have, about 6 minutes. So 2 minutes each. So one is asking, are humans the kind of creatures that are able to cope with working less? Are we cut out for leisure, or is their work life not just a reflection of our restless natures and the need to be productive or busy?
So I would say on that, I think there's a distinction between work and activity in general, which and work under capitalism. And it seems to me that work under capitalism harnesses whether this desire is restless and never fulfilled, or just kind of more gentle, for activity that people have and for meaning that people have, and puts that to work for the profit motive. So I'd say it might be the case that humans are unsuited to doing nothing at all. I think I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that people always want to do something, but what exactly that looks like is kind of still up for grabs. And it doesn't have to look like the work we currently do. There's a quote in the Keynes article where he talks about how we could work a lot less, and he says in the future people will have to face up to the difficult task of working out what it is they really want to do, which I think is interesting, an interesting claim.
That's a great brief answer, or as I think it was Pascal who said, that the origin of all social problems is the inability of people to sit alone with their thoughts. So in that sense, we can build on that. So Fatima is asking, so I'm just going to abbreviate this question. Is the way that the system is designed for mass productivity not in direct contradiction with how the heart's needs are met, in the sense of, it seems that the pandemic has given rise to contemplation and perhaps an opportunity to review beliefs and outcomes in relation to quality of life over time? Do you think that has happened?
I think in some cases, yes, although there's that kind of brief bit of space. There was room to breathe at the beginning of the pandemic for some people, not for everyone. Some people still had to go into work and do the same things. But there was a period of time when a lot of people were on furlough, and a lot of people, before it became financially much more difficult because they'd lost cumulative income, where it seemed like a lot of people were reevaluating that. I think one thing I worry about is how possible it would be for firms, for companies to co-opt that desire and say, okay, so you want to be doing anything else? Don't worry, we have a 1-week retreat where we will focus on making sure you're the best worker possible by making sure you relax as well as possible. So I think there is a contradiction there, but I think that kind of contradiction can be claimed and co-opted by capital, by employers.
I think it's also interesting to observe that, you know, the possible consequences of that mode of thinking, which is not focused on productivity and that kind of is not focused on attaining and sort of keeping work, were clearly so dangerous to so many people, and people in positions of power, that there has been sort of a concentrated policy and political move to get back to work as soon as possible. And I think we can see that both in the sort of British government's drive to get back to work and get back out there. So it's almost as if governments are really afraid of what might happen if people did actually have some time to contemplate what life is really about, or what kind of life they would want. We have one question left, which I think is kind of nice and exploratory. Although I have to say I take an issue with it. I'll explain what it is. It's asking, hi Amelia, are there many philosophers doing interesting work on work at the moment, or does your book mainly rely on economists, social theorists, etc.? The issue I take is with the distinction between social theorists and philosophers, but now that I have noted that, I leave it to you to answer the last question.
I think that when I started doing my PhD, there were very few people working on work, but now there are many more, which is great. I would say there's a few different streams. One is Republican political philosophy, which looks at domination. So Elizabeth Anderson has a book called Private Government. Tom O'Shea has some really interesting work on socialist republicanism, where he tries to push it in a more radical direction, which I think is great. Orlando Lazar does a similar thing and looks at UBI through a similar lens. Then there is a kind of focus on time by, I think, Martin Hagland and some others as well, which is saying, we need to politicize this question of time. And there's the kind of feminist current, which comes through people like Kathy Weeks, Helen Hester, which says, which takes that kind of feminist focus on the household, the family, and work in general, and looks at that. And there's also a kind of revival of interest in questions around social reproduction as well. So there's quite a lot. I in the book, I think I draw on them, and also on mainly on historical stuff. My background, my original degree, my undergraduate was in history, and I think philosophers and social theorists, but all in one loose category, should often draw more on empirical and historical stuff than they do. It's a big problem I see in kind of contemporary political philosophy, is that there's almost historical illiteracy. So that's one thing I try and draw out in the book too. Less economic stuff, I guess kind of general sociological thinking about contemporary economies, political economy, I guess, rather than economics.